I'm Petal Furness. I'm currently the president of the OMA, and I'm so pleased with the conference and how well it's been going and how much I've been getting out of it and all the positive feedback that I've heard. Also, a little bird told me that today might be, man, am I nervous? It might be our executive director's birthday. Is that true, Marie? It is. Let's sing happy birthday. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Marie. Happy birthday to you. Yay! I saw it on Facebook. Great. Well, I'd like to welcome you today for our GLAM Summit. I just love that word. We'd like to welcome our many partners from GLAM, the cultural sector, government, and funding partners. We are pleased to be joined by partners from provincial heritage organizations such as the Archives Association of Ontario, the Multicultural History Society of Ontario, the Ontario Genealogical Society, the City of Toronto, the Ontario Historical Society, and our other partners from the Ontario Library Association, Toronto Public Library, Southern Ontario Library Service, the Arts Advocate, Ontario Science Centre, and the City of Toronto Archives and the Royal Ontario Museum. Woohoo! Thank you. The significant public trust in GLAMs as acknowledged institutions stems largely from their commitment to objectivity and truthfulness. Our current world sees cynicism and increased partisanship on the rise, challenging courts, newspapers, and constitutional institutions. This next panel will unpack what are the opportunities for GLAMs to promote civic engagement in support of our democratic values and freedoms. And more importantly, how can we do this collaboratively? I have four very distinguished guests. I've been worried about this all day because they're so amazing. I'm pleased to welcome Shelley Falconer from the Art Gallery of Hamilton, Vickery from the Toronto Public Library, John Roberts, Chief Privacy Officer and Archivist of Ontario from the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services, and at the very end, Christina Tessier, who's the CEO of Ingenium. Please help me welcome them today. I'm just going to say a little bit about each of them. If they want to add something later, please go ahead. Ms. Falconer is the President and CEO of the Art Gallery of Hamilton. Her 25-year career includes national and international experience as a consultant, curator, educator, and administrator. She has worked as a senior manager and consultant with a variety of important cultural and educational organizations, including the McMichael Canadian Art Collection, University of Toronto, Centennial College, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the Toronto District School Board, Department of Heritage, Government of Canada, Sotheby's London, and Waddington Galleries, England. Ms. Falconer has directed and managed numerous award-winning projects, including exhibitions and installations for Rideau Hall in Ottawa, Canada House in London, England, and the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. She has also authored and produced numerous exhibit texts and catalogs, including the publication Stones, Bones, and Stitches, Storytelling Through Inuit Art. Her award-winning Art to Life, the Canadian Century digital project won a prestigious United Nations World Summit Award for Best in E-Contact and Creativity. Ms. Falconer was also awarded a York District School Board Applause Award for outstanding contributions to education and the community. See why I was nervous to introduce these folks? Ms. Falconer was also the keynote speaker at our OMA Inclusive Museum Leadership Symposium, so this will be another time we get to hear from her. Welcome, Shelley. Vickery is the city librarian at Toronto Public Library, a 100-branch library system serving 2.8 million people. She believes passionately in the difference public libraries make in the lives of individuals, in communities, and cities. Vickery has worked in a number of leadership positions, spearheading service development that supports capacity building, civic engagement, economic development, and social cohesion. She is currently working to advance TPL's new strategic plan and its digital strategies that support new service. John Roberts is the Chief Privacy Officer and Archivist of Ontario at the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services since September 2015. He has over 25 years of experience ranging from operational, policy and senior leadership roles to government information management and digital government initiatives in both the New Zealand and Ontario public services. His extensive knowledge of information management and privacy protection has contributed to his numerous achievements, which include successfully creating and leading the policy design and implementation of new public record-keeping legislation in New Zealand, supporting major organizational change in the New Zealand public sector, leading strategic engagement with New Zealand state sector agencies to support their involvement with the Government Chief Information Officer and Government Chief Privacy Officer. Since arriving in Canada, he has overseen the development of the OPS record-keeping, access, and privacy transformation strategy, the Archives of Ontario's successful Ontario 150 commemoration program, and has been part of the multi-ministry leadership on enterprise data integration work. And at the end of our table is Christina Tessier, who was appointed to the position of President and CEO of Ingenium, Canada's Museum of Science and Innovation, in June of 2018. Prior to her appointment, Christina served since 2014 as the Director General of Canada Science and Technology Museum, where she led the fast-tracked renewal of the exhibition galleries and visitor experience elements for the museum, which reopened in November in 2018. Prior to her role as Director General, Christina was Director of Operations at Ingenium's Canada Aviation and Space Museum. Christina has worked in the cultural field for close to 18 years at various institutions, including the Portrait Gallery of Canada, Parks Canada, where her work focused on National Historic Sites, and at Ottawa's Bytown Museum. She has also served on a number of committees and juries for the Canadian Museums Association, Ontario Museums Association, and the City of Ottawa. She was president of the Council and Heritage Organizations in Ottawa and the founding chair of the Ottawa Museums Network. So that's a little overview of all of our 4 participants. Each of our panelists will have a chance to present for 5 minutes on the challenges faced and current collaborations in their respective institutions. And then we'll move into a facilitated question period, and if we have time, then there'll be some time for an open question and answer period at the end. So could we start with you, Shelley?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
So you want me to use this mic?
You can use that mic, or
there
I can move the mic over here for you. There you go. There you go. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here, Marie. Unfortunately, it was only a few days ago, I think, that Marie said, you only have 5 minutes. So, and for those of you that know me, that's a bit of a challenge, but I'm really going to try hard. It's nice to be back at an OMA conference. And I apologize for that long introduction. Next time, you have to get this shortened. It's a little long for you to have to listen to. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Art Gallery of Hamilton, because Marie really wanted me to give you some more intimate insight into what happens in our organization, I'm going to quickly give you a sense of who we are and what we are. We're a 105-year-old art museum now. And I say that because it brings, of course, with it a lot of baggage when you're 105 years old. We're the 3rd largest art collection in the province, and one of the top 6 in terms of scope and size in the country. And I think it's important to know that because the gallery, certainly in the last, it's a gallery that has a very distinguished collection, but it's also had to navigate some very challenging waters because of its collection and because of its age. And for that reason, that notion of democratic and inclusivity has actually been quite challenging, not only because of the age of our collection, but also because we're an art museum and a public art gallery. And I think, unlike some of my colleagues in the library world and the science museums, I think we have been much slower to address a lot of the change and reflect a lot of those changes out there that exist in our communities. I think, or I believe, it's been a lot more challenging. So what I'd like to do today is share with you some examples of how we've begun to shift. It's something, when I came in 5 years ago, it was certainly one of the agendas that I was given by our board, and how we've tried to move towards a much more emphatic social agenda. And what's underlying that philosophically has been a strong belief that I have and the colleagues that I work with in the powerful role that museums, that art can bring in bringing about social change. And part of that is a very different value system to maybe the way that a lot of us were raised, whether it was through our academic education, and also the way that a lot of us have been, and I know Marie's addressed that a lot in the previous year. The OMA has been looking at that. There have been some very frightening facts that we've had to deal with in terms of how much, or perhaps how little, our profession reflects the community out there. I think if we look at the room, we'd all agree that that remains a challenge for all of us. But some of the values that we're working with are about unmasking and deconstructing, being much more transparent about dominant and marginalized cultures, and maintaining a much more reflexive critique of museological and art historical practices. So I'm going to start by just quickly giving you, I'm going to move through it, and hopefully if there are questions that I haven't addressed, we can do that in the Q&A so that I get through this in 5 minutes. Okay. So I wanted to bring this up right away, which are some of, I think, the challenges and where we're trying to move from where we've been. As a public art museum, I think, and it was certainly what I was given when I came in 5 years ago, that lots of perceptions of elitism. And to be honest, a lot of it's true. Whether you look at who sits on our boards, you have to remember that a lot of our collections come out of either middle class or wealthy individuals who leave. That's how our institutions are born. That's often how they're maintained. And it is certainly how they continue to grow. So that elitism versus populism. Control versus freedom and access. We all live in a world, and whether it's records or material culture or aesthetic objects, we're about holding those collections in trust, preserving and controlling access. And yet, we're living in this world where we're supposed to be right now about providing access and freedom. So constantly working with that tension. Colonialism versus decolonization. Well, a lot of, again, our collections are born out of colonization. So how do we move into decolonization in a way that continues to preserve, at essence, what our mission and mandates are? And of course, authority versus expertise. We live in a culture that has very little respect for authority today, but truly respects expertise. So again, that's a tension that we're constantly having to manage. So these are some of the examples in the past year that we have been, I would say, moving through, and you'll see them reflected in exhibitions as well as our collections. This is a photographer, Sarah Angelucci, a well-known Canadian photographer who teaches at Ryerson. She created a project for us where she went into the oldest factory in Hamilton, mid-19th century, one of the oldest in Canada, where they created apparel, and created a whole exhibition called Piecework, which was about reflecting on the people. And again, this is a group that's rarely talked about, but it's a group, and for those of you that don't know what piecework is, it's what a lot of newly arrived immigrants, mostly women, by the way, would create work. You didn't have to speak English, and would be paid for each piece that you made. So what she decided to do was create a compelling exhibition and worked with those women. And these are some of the women. And of course, over many decades, depending on the different groups that came in, the 50s and 60s, there were Italians, there were waves of groups that came in from the Caribbean. This, in fact, is reflecting very much some of the Asian population that's been coming into the area. She worked with them to create interesting sound and visual aesthetic pieces. This is another collaboration with West Coast well-known artist Robert Davidson, who curated a show where he not only had his own contemporary work that's very contemporary, well-known, but he placed it in context with Haida artifacts to talk a lot about what it meant to be himself a contemporary Indigenous artist, reflecting on his own past, reaching into those colonial collections, a very important collection actually held at the McCourt Art Museum in Montreal. The Chedot collection from the Hamilton Sanatorium. That was a really important collection that was actually about to be dispersed by the Hamilton Health Sciences hospitals. That sanatorium was the largest intake for the Inuit in Canada. And when I found out about it, I wanted to bring the collection in. It was an incredibly arduous process to bring that collection in, very sensitive, and we decided to begin to make that process transparent, but we combined it with a contemporary Inuit artist, Barry Petal, and in the back you can see where he did a really interesting series called the Awareness Series of those actual discs that the Inuit, and they still have them, where with the numbers, which is how the federal government identified them, which is a very disturbing, interesting, and it's him reflecting on that and then portraits of those individuals, and we combined that with a display of the Hamilton Sanatorium. This is a group of students, an exchange between Hamilton and Pangerton, where we had them come in. It was an exchange with a school in Hamilton, and we involved them in the work we had to do with that sanatorium collection. So those students helped to inform our understanding of not only what those works were about, but what was actually going on in those works. And we had fascinating stories that were shared with us, whether it was them telling us about their grandparents in those sanatoriums, identifying some of the narrative taking place in the work. It was a compelling learning experience for us as well as them. Shelley Nero, 1779. This is an artist from Six Nations in our own backyard who wanted to talk to us about that incredible Haudenosaunee influx of Indigenous that came when the Civil War was taking place into Canada. So she meditates on that, and it was an enormously compelling piece because she also went into our permanent collection, brought out some of those works about place right there in the region, but then also created some contemporary works to reflect on that. And I'm going to quickly move through. There's Shelley discussing this with some of our staff. And I'm going to quite quickly wrap this up with Ed Bertinsky, Witness and Water, which we did last year, which was a sort of, this is Ed talking about his practice over the last 30 to 40 years on water, which was a really thoughtful, a whole lower level was turned over to this whole piece around the environment. And it involved over 100 artists, including Ed's work, so it was a very big project for us. Hamilton Now, where we're involving these different artists who sit on the margins and really looking at identity and the process of identity in their own practices. And finally, Speaking for Herself, where we decided to address the fact that there are hardly any women in our collection. The percentage is shockingly low. So this is an exhibition which really just looks at that issue, brings out some of those women artists, and deconstructs why that's taking place, and that's actually on view now. And finally, some of the partnerships and relationships we have with our local hospital network, which is a very large one around dementia. This we did with the Water and Environmental Project, Troubling Footprints. And finally, the Hamilton Youth Poets, who is a group in the region who are really about looking at how to decolonize education. And we sort of turned our space over to them over the last few years and are really working with them in some very deep partnerships. I'm going to wrap it up because I know I'm getting the evil eye. That's my few minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here today and to contribute to the OMA annual conference. So I just want to start off by saying that this is a really exciting time to be working in public libraries. Public libraries are busier than ever. We're offering a greater array of services than ever at a time when our customers are expecting more than ever. And so this afternoon, I want to talk about one aspect of library service that has been growing and developing in response to some challenges we're facing in the 21st century. And in the process of that, I'll touch on the importance of collaboration in making all of this happen. So there are many reasons a public library card is important, but near the top of the list is the fact that the public library has been a democratizing force in the modern world, supporting literacy and a literate population, equitable access to a diversity of information and ideas, intellectual freedom, protection of privacy, lifelong learning, and accessible public space that's open to all. And today, we're seeing more and more challenges to those democratic values and principles throughout the world. So civic engagement and discourse are more important than ever. And at Toronto Public Library, we've established ourselves as a place for public discourse, discussion, and debate in the city. And we've done this in a number of different ways, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So public libraries, just generally, that we really need collaborations and partnerships in order to achieve whatever it is we're setting out to do, and that's certainly true with civic engagement. Collaborations with organizations such as the Canadian Journalism Foundation and media outlets such as the CBC and the Toronto Star, and others such as the Library and Archives Canada help make all of this happen. And a really important foundation of all of this is the fact that libraries are accessible, and not just because they're free, but because they're local, reaching and serving people where they live, and they're tailored to meet the particular needs of the communities and the individuals that they serve. And I always say that one of the great strengths of public libraries is that we're not just one institution. In Toronto, we have 100 branches, so we have 100 institutions in 100 different neighborhoods across the city, serving and reaching people where they live. And local personalized access as part of a livable urban form is really uniquely positioning libraries as a place of trust. And that puts us in a really strong position to address some of the issues we need to address in terms of civic engagement. A major initiative that we launched this year is a series of programming that's going on for a year and a half called On Civil Society. And this series really highlights the library as a platform where issues can be discussed openly and without judgment, involving democracy, the media, urbanism, equity, wellness, and economics, and how these issues are changing in Canada today and in the Canada of the future. And we challenge people to get out of their bubble and to think differently about different issues and ideas. So On Civil Society includes events that are both digital and live events with writers, thinkers, personalities, politicians, looking squarely at some of the biggest and most challenging issues of our time. So we're going to have Beverly McLaughlin, we've had Michael Adams and Tariq Ali. They're just some of the people we've engaged to spark the debate and discussion on topics such as freedom of speech, justice, and the role of the press in a democratic society. And then the series also includes workshops and an activist fair on how our patrons can get involved in grassroots organizations for political causes and social justice. And then recently, we developed a new website for the municipal election here in Toronto. And we did this because we believe so strongly that access to information and the healthy exchange of ideas are fundamental to our democracy, and that we have an important role to play in that. So we developed this website, and we actually started working on it well before the whole debate about the number of wards. And as we were developing it, we started out with 47 words, and then we went back to 25 words, and then we went back to 47 words. So it was a little challenging at times, but we realized at the end of it as well that it was even more important to have this site, given all of the discussions about the ward boundaries, because people could use the site, put in their address, or click on a map, and it would tell them exactly what ward they were in and who the candidates were running in their area, as well as an overview of the topics and the issues that were at play. And we've also developed democracy kit programs that have been offered in different branches of the city. And these workshops teach people how to join a campaign, run for office, or be influential in their community. So these are things that you don't normally think of, I think, when you think library, but it's something we're very much involved in. And then, of course, I think there's an important role for us to play, and there are huge opportunities for collaboration in response to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report to respond to the calls for action. And this is also about civic engagement on an incredibly important issue. So here's an example of where we've curated an exhibit in our TD gallery with Library and Archives Canada in collaboration with a number of Indigenous communities to celebrate contemporary Indigenous art as well as historical materials. And then the other part of all of this is, of course, is programming. And programming is something that public libraries have always done. But our programming has developed and evolved to much higher profile programming. And a few years ago, we opened a new event space at our Toronto Reference Library called the Bram and Bluma Appel Salon. And it's become a vibrant literary and cultural commons where people can explore issues both as Torontonians, but also as global citizens. And while programming is something we've always done, today's technology actually allows us to open up what we're doing not only to a much broader audience, making it accessible to everyone, anywhere, anytime, but also to offer much more opportunities to engage in and contribute to the conversation. And finally, what I want to say is, what I think we have to remember in these efforts and opportunities for collaboration is that this isn't just beneficial to the individual. They expand Toronto's knowledge, skills, and networks and engage residents of all age so that all Torontonians have the opportunity to learn about issues, topics, and different viewpoints on different issues, and ultimately contribute to the success of their communities, but more importantly, to the democratic values that we all hold so dear. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'd just like to echo the thanks of the other speakers for the invitation to come and talk to you this afternoon. I've decided not to use any PowerPoint slides in the interests of time. I know myself well enough to know that if I had even 3 or 4 slides, there's no way I would stick to 5 minutes on this subject. And I know that you're too smart an audience to fall for the old trick of if you put it on a PowerPoint slide and project it on a large screen, it must be true. It was tempting, however, to put a couple of spurious statements in my bio and see if anyone picked up on fake news in there, but I resisted that temptation as well. In thinking about the subject that we're discussing this afternoon, there's so much in there, but there's just a few concepts that I'd like to pick up on from an archives perspective. And the first one really is around that idea of objectivity and truthfulness. Now, archives, as many of you know, are far more than just repositories of culturally significant documents. Archives really speak to records as authentic evidence of business. So it's very tempting for us to say, well, if that's the business we're in, then fake news, no issue. We do truthfulness, so we're just ahead of that game. But of course, there's a whole lot more to it than that. Records are an authentic record of what happened, but every record still carries a particular bias, a perspective, a context. Records can't just be read at face value. So for an archives, a lot of these issues about truthfulness and objectivity are quite nuanced. How do we help people understand not just what a record says, but what does it really mean? How do we document that, and how do we avoid bias, privileging certain perspectives in the way that we document? How do we avoid privileging those perspectives in the way we collect and acquire? These issues are really important professional challenges for archives as we seek to continue that commitment to objectivity and truthfulness, but recognise the challenges that come with that. Of course, that role that we have in providing a factual record of activity is often enshrined in mandates. For my institution, the Provincial Archives, the Archives of Ontario, that's part of our legislation. Part of our mandate is to foster accountability and transparency. But what does that actually mean? Now, it's one thing to be charged with that, but the complexity associated with it is really quite difficult. And as a couple of speakers have mentioned earlier today, archives are often the invisible limb of the GLAM sector. We don't have a school archives highly visible in the way that schools have a library that's a part of people's experience growing up. As the provincial archives, we still have far fewer people through the door than either the ROM or the AGO or Vickery's institutions. So archives are in many ways highly dependent on the collaboration that we can get in the GLAM space to bring our opportunities, our content to the masses, to help them have access to those records that can illuminate contemporary issues and provide an authentic base for discussion. For archivists, there's often a frustration at listening to news or public discourse that it seems so disconnected from the evidence base and the facts that we know are recorded, we know are in our care, and we know are accessible through easy channels and yet not consumed by those who seem to have such a passion for those precise issues. Collaboration with partners such as libraries, museums, can get our material more readily embedded in public discourse. But that's only part of it. Once the records are known and visible, we need to make sure that people have the understanding, the capacity, the literacy, if you like, to make sense of them, which is why a lot of our educational programs that take a collaborative approach aren't just about showcasing interesting, attractive historic documents, but put an emphasis on building a critical sensibility, a discernment, an ability to challenge what is true, what do records really mean when people are reading them. In a sense, I know that's a perspective shared by all of our partners, which is why we know that people are very keen to help collaborate and get that educational impact beyond just the historical content of the artefacts, to be developing that ability to criticise, to interpret, to be aware of the nuance of context, perspective, and inherent bias in information artefacts. The other piece that's noted in the blurb about the panel that I think is worth picking up on is trust, public trust. Because we often assume that because we are institutions charged with preserving authentic knowledge and a mandate that is about objectivity and education, that we will have public trust. And I think, yes, we are trusted institutions. That's evident when you see surveys of the sorts of places that do have the confidence of the public at large. But I would challenge everyone in the room not to take that trust for granted. Why do we think we deserve public trust? What is it that we do to earn it and continue to earn it in an age when we know that cynicism, that abuse of trust is actually quite prevalent? Why should people believe that the sources found in our institutions have a higher validity, a higher impact than other sources that they might find online? And indeed, it's online where I think these challenges are greatest. It's in the same way that once upon a time, the adage was, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. I think on the internet, no one knows you're a highly trusted public institution funded to ensure evidential integrity. So as information that we put online to enhance accessibility, to make it available to many people, becomes disconnected from our own context of institutional stewardship, how can we ensure that it continues to be given the status that it deserves and the status that we would like to see it play in informing public discourse? So online, huge challenge, also a huge opportunity for us, because online it is as much about networks and connections and relationships rather than standalone institutions. So the opportunities we have for reinforcing each other's activities through connected online activities, I think take the opportunities for collaboration to the next level. So in closing, I'd just like to say archives, actually I think this is a comment I made last time Vickery and I were on a stage together in Ottawa talking about collaboration. I'd just like to suggest that in the GLAM sector, you guys all need the archives more than we need you, because without archives, you have no vowels. You are glum.
Good afternoon, everyone. So who here has heard of Ingenium? No. Oh my God, that's awesome. Okay, so just for those of you who don't know, Ingenium runs 3 national museums of science and innovation in Ottawa: science and tech, aviation and space, and agriculture and food. So let us know the next time you're in Ottawa. We'd be happy to welcome you. So as museums of science and innovation, fake news is particularly concerning to us. The trust that people have in science, the work that technology is already doing to impact what we're seeing on the internet. So let's take a look at an example of some fake news. Got some audio on that?
Even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, I don't know, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or how about this? Simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things. At least.
Who's seen that video before? A few. So that's called a deep fake. So clearly this is not President Obama speaking, right? But it looks like it is. So there was a point in time when we would sit here, as we're all very educated people, and we would say, I know fake news because I know where to read things and I know what to look at, and I can tell if that picture's been faked up. Now we can do this with video, and this is on an app now. So you can go and download the deepfake app, and you can create your own video and have somebody speaking and saying things they have never said in their life and they would never say. So fake news is getting pretty incendiary. It's really catching on in terms of what it can do to our democracy, to our belief in science, to our belief in truth and fact. So it's important that we take a look at that as museums, as GLAMs, and kind of what is our role in trying to preserve that truth. So another quick poll: how many people here think they can tell fake news? Some. No one's going to say it now, right, after we watch that? So the polls will tell you that a lot of people think they can tell fake news, but they don't think their neighbor could tell if the news was fake, right? But how many of you have liked or shared something on Twitter, on Facebook, without kind of actually reading through the whole article? Right? A lot of us do that. And that's how they get us, right? With the bots. And there's all these bots out here, one's to amplify, one's to dampen. All the technology that's behind that. The technology isn't really to blame, of course, right? It's how the people are using that technology in behind. So what does this mean for science? Who's here from the Ontario Science Centre? All right, so the Ontario Science Centre is doing great work in terms of trying to understand what Canadian beliefs are about science and how they're changing. So I want to thank them for the work, because these stats are work that come out of their work. So it's great that people believe that science is contributing to our quality of life. But a majority of people believe that we are turning away from science in favor of ideas that lack evidence. And so that is certainly concerning, and turning to their gut feeling. Well, I think this is true, so I'm going to believe this. I don't care what the scientist tells me. I don't care what I find out there. I don't believe that. And we see below that some of the things that people are starting to believe. And I'm sure there are people in this room who believe what's up there, so this is not to offend anybody. But we take a look at that last one on anti-vaxxers, right? The link between vaccinations and autism. And what's interesting in the study by the Ontario Science Centre is that bumps up to 27% with millennials. So 27%, so even more people who are younger believe in that link. And so as a parent of a young child, and I'm not a millennial, I'm a Gen Xer, as I told folks earlier today. I'm sure you can tell that by my appearance. For me, that's concerning the idea that if we think about measles and polio and things that we worked very hard as a human species to eradicate could come back, because people have decided that they don't believe in the link and they don't believe in vaccination. So that leaves us with a lot of questions. What do we do? So we just heard a whole bunch of questions that we need to address together. And so I think that's the conversation we want to have. A part of it really is on that media literacy training. We need to actually teach people how to go about what research they need to do to believe. How many sources have you looked at? Are they trusted sources? Have you read the entire article? What does this mean? And that's not just for the group of us, but what are we doing in our schools? How do we take this up to a systems level to make a change that's going to be impactful? So we're going to do things in our sites, and that's going to be important, and then we have to think how we're going to work with our school systems and others to make a big difference. So we're talking about collaboration today. For Ingenium, partnerships are incredibly critical to what we do. And these are certainly partnerships with our GLAM partners. They're partnerships across the board. So when we look at starting projects in our institution, we really do look around to see who we should be working with. And that's for a number of reasons. And while we are national museums, we will still tell you we feel like we don't have enough money, we don't have enough people. I know everybody feels this way in the sectors that we work in. We use partners for leverage. The partners bring us audiences and reach. They bring us knowledge and research. They at times bring us money, and they bring us other partners into that network. So we work with industry, we work with academia, we work with government, we work with NGOs. We were talking about tourism earlier. We work to have beer made with our label on it. We want to be out there working with partners around because we're all going to be able to lift each other up and do better work. And I think partnerships are going to be critical to all of our futures as we go forward. We can't be experts in everything we do. We're going to need to have other people at the table that are going to support our work across the GLAM sector. But there's also programming, and we've seen some amazing programming from the rest of the panel in the work that they're doing in their individual institutions. And so Ingenium also has some programming examples that I would share here today. And I think this is similar to what we saw at the Toronto Library, our program called Curiosity on Stage, which is a thought leadership series around what we see as the big science and tech issues that are facing Canada and the world today, to bring that discourse onto our stage and have a conversation. So just last night, we had a talk on fake news. And what's interesting is that was led by the Canadian Securities Establishment. So this is a group most people didn't know about 10, 15 years ago because they kept under the radar as they were monitoring what was going on around the world. But they're realizing more and more that they can't solve the issues of security and fake news alone, that they need all of our help. We as users of all of this technology, they need to help us learn how to do that better. And so they actually sponsored that talk that we did on fake news, where we had an academic there along with a journalist as well. And so we see the other topics here that we're starting to tackle through that series. Of course, climate change is a massive issue, and we see that there are issues around people, whether they actually believe in that or not. And some of the other pieces on fake news, I guess, just to leave you some thoughts on that. So when you see fake news out there, it spreads 6 to 10 times faster than the truth. So if you go out there and try and debunk that piece, you will get hardly any pickup compared to the fake news. Fake news breeds on our emotions. So often those very powerful emotions, our fear, our anger, at times humor, and boy, I can't believe that idiot and what they did. And so it's people reacting from, it's almost an irrationality, right? And so when you try and tell somebody what they're saying isn't true, they have an emotional reaction, not a rational reaction to it. And so it's very hard to debunk fake news in the work we do. And that was some of the learning that we had last night and the work that we were doing. So just ramping it back up to the systems change, because I know we want to get to the conversation. Another piece that we also look at Ingenium then is how do we bring others into the fold of fighting fake news with us? One thing we do is science communication training for scientists. In Ottawa, there are thousands of government scientists who do incredible work, and most of us have no clue what they're doing in their labs. And a lot of those scientists have trouble talking to us as lay people in terms of what their scientific research is. And so we want to get more people talking about the truth about science. And I guess that's kind of the challenge to put out is what are all of the programs we can put out there that we can help others help us in this battle against fake news and bringing the truth to Canadians.
Well, thank you. So my first question, which I'll send to you, Shelley, is our sector often relies on long-term planning and development with exhibitions and programming that are decided years in advance. Do we have a responsibility to rapidly respond to current events, and how can our institutions remain agile in a changing world?
Yeah, it's a question actually that we spent some time asking ourselves. I shared last year that some of you heard me talk about when the Trudeau government decided to let all those Syrian refugees in. There was a huge influx into Hamilton. It was the second largest, actually, intake city after Toronto. And it was sort of my first year there, and I remember watching, because the hotel across the street from the gallery was where they were bringing them in. So every day, cars and vans would pull up with refugees pouring out right across from the art gallery. And of course, there we were with our exhibition schedule and our programs all done and everything set. And I watched this for months. And I remember finally remarking to the staff that it was shocking how we watched day after day they poured in. Their kids weren't in school yet. They were running all over the place. Not once did we reach out as a public art institution to that group. And I remember, when I discussed it with the staff, there was just this kind of, oh my God, it's true, like people noticed, but we didn't have we didn't know even what to do or how to do it, because it was so ingrained in us to plan everything. And by the way, it's not the fault, I think, of individual institutions. It's the way our granting systems are set up. I mean, we just did a Canada Council grant where we had to submit everything we're going to be doing through 22. Right? So it doesn't matter where we apply, everyone wants all our plans down, whether it's to sponsors, corporate sponsors, our board reports, levels of government, funders. So I think it does require, and we have started to make room so that we can begin to respond better, because that was to me, a shocking experience. I felt awful, my staff felt awful, and we really and honestly, and this was about, I guess, 4 or 5 years ago now, we really were challenged as to how to deal with that. And I think we're all going to, and that includes the funding agencies, to find ways to create space for being more responsive. I don't know if that's an answer, but... Okay.
Thank you, Shelley. And if the next question, we can direct it towards Vickery. Institutions that state their position about topical subjects and/or contentious issues may draw criticism and risk public outcry or loss of partnerships. How do we decide which issues we should develop and present and which issues to hold? Oh, sorry, I can pass this down.
Well, I guess I'd start out by saying that public libraries have a set of core values that are as enduring today as they ever have been, and I would say they're probably more important today than they ever have been. Things like intellectual freedom and equitable access to a diversity of information and ideas. And so that applies to our collections and to our programming, to our room bookings, and we have drawn controversy with some things that we've done in terms of topics we've had for programs and books in our collections and even room bookings. But those core values, intellectual freedom, which is, core to our democracy, is something that we feel very, very strongly about in the public library world, and so that really guides us. We don't shy away from controversial topics because we feel we have an obligation to make a diversity of viewpoints accessible, and that, our On Civil Society series is about bringing forward topics that may make people uncomfortable, but that it's important for us to have those discussions in a civil way, and that we hear each other's viewpoints, and we can still walk away, of course, thinking what we thought when we walked into a room for a program, but the point is that we air those ideas and make them accessible and available to all, and that civil public debate is important for all of us. So we don't shy away from those things, and sometimes it is, you can be in a really uncomfortable situation where you're defending intellectual freedom, but it's absolutely paramount to the public library world that we work in.
If I can just add something on that one, I think it's important that we distinguish between taking a position and informing debate on something. I see our role as knowledge institutions as providing a platform for informed debate rather than necessarily being the advocates for individual positions. As socially aware individuals, obviously we will have personal views on all of these things, but I believe our professional stance is to support that deeply informed, educated debate, bringing forward the insights from each of our institutions to support that discourse.
Of course, I choose the microphone, but I can't see the power button. Did that work? No, it doesn't work. Sorry. Great. I said part 2 for you, Vickery, sorry. And that was, those on the panel represent larger institutions in the largest of Ontario cities. What are the responsibilities for smaller institutions with or without diverse communities that share the institution's values?
Well, I think that smaller institutions have the same responsibilities, and I think that the larger institutions can provide leadership on a lot of these topics and offer briefings and program information and whatever is needed to support smaller institutions. And certainly I can speak for the public library world that it's very collaborative, and we're looking to collaborate more outside of where we are, and it's an important part of what we do, because whether you're in a small institution, medium, or large, we're all dealing with many of the same issues, and it's important for us to share how we're handling those kinds of issues. And technology certainly provides us with a great opportunity to do that in a very efficient and effective sort of way. So I think that, I think we all have responsibilities in this, regardless of what size of institution that you are.
Great. So this question, John, is for you, and that is, what role does our sector have in creating a civil society of the future? And how can we engage younger audiences in discussions or debates?
I think this comes back to a point that each of us has raised around creating that critical thinking, having education programs that are not just about showcasing the content of our collections, but encouraging people to question, to develop critical thinking, and making sure that's a core part of the way that we develop our educational programs. I think all institutions in the sector are collaborating increasingly with educators and not just catering to traditional sort of research elites, if I can put it that way. Archives have been, I think, particularly bad historically at only providing services to academic researchers and the like, rather than recognising the importance of developing those characteristics in the researchers and of tomorrow, and indeed the public participants in debate of tomorrow. But of late, certainly at the Archives of Ontario, our educational programs have really focused on encouraging questioning, encouraging an awareness of context, encouraging people to read beyond the text of a document and think about its context, and build that critical thinking that is so important for the youth of today to become the questioning adults of tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. And our last question is for Christina, and that is, in a sector with such a responsibility for objects, what do you think are our responsibilities in the digital world, including social media? Big question.
Thanks, Petal.
Sorry.
As national museums, for us, digital is a huge opportunity because we have a responsibility to reach out across the country. To do that only through traveling exhibitions or boots on the ground is incredibly expensive. And so at Ingenium, we've really embraced that through a lot of digital gaming apps is one area where we've focused. We actually have a game now out on the Nintendo Switch platform for anybody who's young enough to care about Nintendo Switch. And so we've taken that opportunity as a place to engage with youth where they already are. Because we talked about that idea of 20-somethings and teenagers and how do we get them into our museums. So we're trying to be out in the place that they are. And even in our museums now is creating that social media. So where should I take my picture? Where do I take my selfie to get the best?
Right.
We put those places out so people see them and they use them. And it's really interesting to watch how they engage with that in our Lego exhibit this summer and some opportunities we have in the new museum. But there is a responsibility that comes with that in terms of how do we engage, how do we make sure the information that we're putting out there is accurate and the work that we're doing, and so the work that our team has to do around that, because we don't just want to use it as a tool to push out when our next event is happening. We want to actually engage with people on social media. That means there's a discourse that's happening. And that can be tough sometimes in terms of, and we've heard sometimes when negative people come forward and challenge. For the team that has to run all of those channels, I think there are 27 channels at Ingenium that are managed by a single person. I don't know how she does. She must be a bot in terms of how she's doing that. But for us, we see it as an opportunity to engage and a responsibility to reach out across Canada. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
No? So I'm going to look at our timekeeper, Mary. 7 minutes, so we have time for a few questions. Does anyone have any questions for our esteemed panel? Oh, one question. No. You can borrow one of the ones on, you can borrow this one. Okay.
Thanks. So I have one from one of our live stream listeners, quoting from the Can Muse listserv today at 3:24 p.m. The U.S. Department of Interior asking the U.S. National Archives for permission to destroy critical records that should be preserved for posterity. How do we protect our collections of records from attack by governments?
Yeah.
I guess I have to take a stab at this one. And I think the first line of defense is making sure that those processes by which we evaluate, select and acquire records are transparent and open to public participation. If that acquisition of records is happening behind closed doors, it will be far more vulnerable than if it's a process that's actually open, engages the public in forming a view of what is important. If it's only an archivist that says these records need to be kept for posterity, I think that's a weaker case than if it's based on evidence of public participation in a process that asserts that as a broadly held view that those records should be retained. So I say transparency, engagement, collaboration with the public, I would say, is the first line of defense against those kind of challenges.
Does anyone else have anything to add? No? All right, another question? No. Well, thank you very much, panel. I've learned so much from the session today. Thank you so much. Let's join me in thanking them.
So I'd like to thank on members' behalf our speakers today from galleries and libraries and of course archives and museums. I think we're really grateful that you accepted our invitation to share very generously, not only the information about your innovative programs, but also how to respond to what are tremendous challenges that are presented as we try to explore authority and expertise, as was mentioned, in a difficult world of fake news and, of course, for trusted knowledge institutions. I think this is a particular time, and we really truly thank you for your leadership and for sharing this information with us today. And I'd like to present on behalf of our delegates some presents and thank you for joining us.